So this has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm interested in picking up on a number of the threads that just came out. But let me start by trying to address Leo's larger question of the AFT's role in the social justice movement. As Leo mentioned, I wrote a biography of Al Shanker. I happened to bring a copy of it with me. And I understand they're having a fire sale out here. There are copies available as well. So probably everyone in this room knows, but for those of you who don't, Al Shanker was a big part of the AFT's history. If the AFT is celebrating 100 years, Al Shanker was at the center of basically 1/3 of that. From 1964 to 1997, he was either president of the New York City Union, the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, or the American Federation of Teachers, the national level, or for a while both. He was head of both for part of that. So in my view, Shanker epitomized social justice unionism, as I think Randy does today, in arguing that unions should be about much more than just the narrow self-interest of the folks who are being represented, and that instead unions should fight for a fairer society. And the AFT, and Shanker in particular, defined that fairer society in very specific terms that can be summarized as embracing small d democratic values. And that's what Leo mentioned at the beginning, the import of the AFT's motto, democracy and education, education for democracy. And I think there are three major ways that Shanker helped promote this small d democratic vision and advance social justice unionism. The first was Shanker's belief that teachers had to be part of the fight for economic justice broadly by being part of the larger trade union movement. Now, this is important because not all teacher organizations, teacher unions in this country believe that they should be part of the larger union movement and the AFL-CIO. Shanker did, and that was a major difference between him and some others. Secondly, I would argue Shanker was very much at the forefront of the civil rights movement. Again, many teachers disagreed in New York City when he got involved in civil rights. They said, no, we should be focusing on bread and butter issues, wages and benefits. Why are you involved in these distractions? And Shanker disagreed. He thought teachers should be part of the civil rights movement. And the third area is on international human rights. And I see my friend Eric Chenoweth here, who's written a brilliant piece on Shanker and his promotion of democracy abroad and human rights abroad. So any tough questions you have, Eric is here to field. Again, this was controversial within the AFT. Why would a teachers union even have an international policy or an international affairs department? Many people thought that, like our president-elect, we should put America first, and Shanker thought differently. So I want to elucidate those 3 points, and also play off of some of what Clarence mentioned on school integration and what Dan mentioned on Ocean Hill, Brownsville. Okay, so this first point about being part of the larger trade union movement. The AFT is a unique institution. There are other labor unions that represent workers, and there are other organizations that represent teachers. But it's only the American Federation of Teachers that stands directly at the intersection of the two great movements for democracy in this country, public schools, public education, and the trade union movement. So Shanker was for trade unions not only because they are able to represent the interests of workers, but also because they would play this larger role in a democracy. He argued there's no freedom or democracy without trade unionism. And abroad, the first thing a dictator does is to get rid of free trade unions. Now, that took some convincing for teachers, right? Teachers in New York City, when Al Shanker was seeking to organize them in the 1950s, did not see themselves as connected to trade unions broadly or to unions in, even representing their own interests. So there was a lot of opposition to the idea that we should have collective bargaining for teachers that Shanker had to fight against. So for many teachers in New York City, the idea was, unions are for blue-collar people, and so my parents, might make sense for them to be in a union, but I'm a college-educated professional, and therefore I don't need a union. And the National Education Association was strongly opposed to collective bargaining at the time, calling it unprofessional. And so Shanker asked, the question: if you're being paid less than those who are washing cars for a living, is that being treated like a genuine professional? And then the question answered itself, and so teachers came to embrace collective bargaining across the country. But even to this day, my good friends in the National Education Association, the much larger union, have not become part of the American AFL-CIO. Right? They have not become full-fledged members of the trade union movement. And some of the reluctance, I think, has to do with that snobbery that Al Shanker faced when he was organizing teachers. That it's why do we want to be in with those who may not have college degrees? So, and that issue came up for Al Shanker in Buffalo. When the AFT and the NEA were battling over who would represent the teachers there. And the NEA argued, locals at the time argued, that their lack of affiliation with the AFL-CIO was a badge of honor. So one NEA placard asked, do you want to be affiliated with plumbers, carpenters, and sheet metal workers? And Al Shanker's answer, and the answer of the AFT going back to its founding was a resounding yes. And the part of the idea was that if you want to really serve teachers, you also have to serve the interests of children, and that if children grow up with good housing and good health care and good wages, which the AFL-CIO is fighting for, then teachers can actually do a better job. So there was a time period when the AFT and the NEA entered merger talks. Shanker made it a precondition that this merged union would have to be part of the AFL-CIO. It was that important to him. And NEA members ultimately rejected the merger largely on that basis. So Al Shanker could have become the president of the biggest union in the country, this merged union of NEA and AFT. And instead he gave up that chance because this principle of social justice unionism was very important to him. And this merged organization had to be part of the larger trade union movement. Okay, second issue is civil rights. And I would argue that Al Shanker was one of the staunchest backers of civil rights that the nation has known. Going back to his days in college when he participated in sit-ins, he was part of the, provided funding for an organization for the 1963 March on Washington, even though, as Dan points out, the AFL-CIO at that time was not endorsing the march. In 1964, the UFT gave Martin Luther King their John Dewey Award. In 1965, Shanker marched with King and Selma, again donated money. In 1966, when the United Federation of Teachers was asked the question, would they back a civilian review board for the police to review police brutality? The UFT was the only union to endorse that idea. No other union did, and it got Shanker in a lot of trouble with the police union at the time, but he thought it was the right thing to do. And I'll agree with Clarence's point that on the 1964 efforts to integrate schools, the UFT was on the sidelines. But at the same time, Shanker was developing a plan for what were called the more effective schools, which were really the first magnet schools this country has ever had, where you put extra resources into some schools as a way of trying to draw kids of different backgrounds together. And to my mind, it was a very practical way of approaching the integration question. Now, then comes Ocean Hill-Brownsville in 1968. About which Dan spoke. So here's where I differ. I think that Shanker's position in Ocean Hill-Brownsville was completely consistent with social justice, unionism, and the deeper principles of the civil rights movement, as did Bayard Rustin, who sided with the UFT, and as did A. Philip Randolph. So this was, just to give a little bit of background for those of you who haven't followed this closely, this was a struggle that began in 1967 when the Ford Foundation allied with the Black Power movement to create greater community control of schools, with the first experiment being in the ghetto of Ocean Hill-Brownsville. And all hell broke loose when the administrator in Ocean Hill-Brownsville unilaterally terminated the employment of 19 educators, 18 white, 1 African-American. The African-American teacher was then subsequently reinstated when it was discovered that he was African-American. So there were no legitimate issues brought up against the teachers for dismissal. There was one case where people claimed that a teacher didn't have control of the classroom. Desks and chairs were being thrown, and it turned out the chairs were bolted to the ground in that classroom. And so there was an African-American judge who looked dispassionately at these issues and found there was no reason for the dismissal. So this was something new and different, right? Unions had been used to assault from conservatives. They were used to that. That was what everyone expected. But this was the first kind of liberal assault on labor. And so the question is, do we simply look at the identity of those who are assaulting labor and consider their skin color and decide on that basis, or do we stick with important principles? And Bayard Rustin, Al Shanker, Michael Harrington said that liberalism has stood for several things. It stood for school integration over separation, black separation or white separation. It stood for the right to unionize and not to be dismissed for arbitrary reasons. And it stood for the idea that race should not count in who's being hired or fired. And Rustin and Randolph made the point in the debates at the time. These are principles that at the end of the day are meant to protect African American workers in particular. That it was very dangerous to say that we were going to allow race to enter into these decisions. And so because there was tension between people in Ocean Hill-Brownsville and the UFT, which was at the time largely white, Shanker was unfairly branded as being anti-civil rights in this discussion. Now that pained Al Shanker tremendously, which is why in the next chapter it was so important for him to organize the largely African American and Latino paraprofessionals in New York City. in 1970, he worked with others to provide better wages and benefits for those who were teachers' aides, paraprofessionals in New York City. But as importantly, to fight for a career ladder where the city would pay for paraprofessionals to go back to school, get their high school degree, get their college degree, and then become teachers. And Rustin called this, the most important affirmative action program in the country. Al Shanker said that this was one of the things he was most proud of, bringing the paraprofessionals on. And when some of the teachers, again, this issue of snobbery came up, some of the teachers said, well, we don't want paraprofessionals in our union because they don't have college educations. We're a union of professionals only. That's the one time that Al Shanker said, I will resign if we do not bring in this group of largely African-American and Latinos workers who should be part of our cause. Okay, so I've got 2 minutes left. The third piece I'll say very quickly. Human rights abroad. So Shanker was established an international affairs department, and he did so, it was controversial. Why does a teachers union have an international affairs department? But he argued that teachers play a unique role in any society. They are, in the words of Felix Frankfurter, the priests of democracy, right? They're essential to making democracy work, and so therefore we should be supporting teachers in other societies who could promote human rights and democracy. So Shanker was on the board of the International Rescue Committee, the National Endowment for Democracy, modeling the efforts. And I'll just say very quickly, it was on the right-wing dictatorships, left-wing dictatorships, he opposed them all. So it was in Poland, in Central America. He opposed totalitarian regimes on the left and also on the right in the Philippines, South Africa, and Chile. So in closing, what ties all this together? The commitment to public education, unionism, civil rights, human rights, was a profound commitment to democracy, which I think is particularly important to remember at this moment in time. Our democracy is being threatened in the United States. We have a proposed education secretary who wants to privatize our system of education, a man with authoritarian tendencies who next week will be sworn in as president. It seems to me the social justice unionism tied to promoting democratic values is really more important than ever. Thank you.